Everyone, hello, welcome. Welcome to the third of four art talks here at the Lower Red Sea Leslie M. McFadden Visual Arts Program, and I'm the director of the program, Ben Sloat. And I'll introduce tonight's speaker, Diana Al-Hadid. The series of talks concludes tomorrow with a talk by the multimedia artist Peter Coyne. The thematic for the series of talks has been collapse and decadence. In this thematic, certain structures, social or otherwise, fall apart and collapse, only to be met by a new kind of flourishing and blossoming, a decadence. Diana Al-Hadid's work, mixed media works, often transform classical motifs into ethereal and dynamic states that suggest not only ruin and decay, but a kind of historical suspension. In a larger sense, her work proposes a kind of alchemy, where cascades of material pause and, as they defy gravity, generate glorious new structures in a permanent state of transition. Born in Aleppo, Syria, Diana and her family moved to Ohio when she was 5. And Diana has shared this wonderful insight about her upbringing. Quote, "I was educated by modernist instructors in the Midwest, but also raised in an Islamic household with a culture that very much prizes narrative and folklore." Diana's work is currently on display at the DeKorff Museum nearby in Lincoln, Massachusetts. This past May, she opened her first major outdoor public art installation, Delirious Matter, at Madison Square Park in New York City. And this coincides with a solo exhibition opening at the Bronx Museum of Art next month. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Diana Al-Hadid.
Hi, thank you all. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you all for coming. It's a tough day today. You can hear me, right? Okay. I did a talk a few weeks ago for a symposium on public art with Madison Square Park, and it was like a 10-minute talk, and I mixed up all the images, and it really unlocked a lot of things in my mind about my work. So I didn't really do that this time, but hopefully you'll benefit from some of those insights. I don't know. I'm going back to kind of chronological is what I'm trying to say, but I'm also going to try to go pretty fast because I think I'm covering a lot. I'm starting pretty early. I will show some. This is actually me. In a paper plate dress that my mother made for me for a Halloween costume when we first moved to the States. And this is a reference image, I guess. This was actually a place I visited in Lebanon. As Ben mentioned, I was born in Syria, so I went back to Syria when I was a teenager. So my first visit, I guess, home was when I was 13. And this was a cave in Lebanon, outside of Tripoli, and it was a very. I've realized recently that my work has had so much to do with caves and landscape since I've at a young age, I guess. I grew up in Ohio, so I think one of the things that was really striking about this was the artificial lighting and the natural setting. When I went back, I was undergrad. I made this work called Plated Cave with that memory in mind and with my mom's Halloween costume, which taught me a lot about structural integrity and how to build space by using membranes and thin planes. And you'll see much of my work has to do with constructing structures out of membranes and line, so drip and puddle in a sense. This is another large piece I did for undergrad. Again, here I'm kind of noticing how my work often has an interior and exterior relationship, and there's a sense of at least in the earlier work, there was like this kind of feminine landscape going on. This was like an unzipping mountain that opened up to a cast of a Victoria's Secret underwear. You can see the zip. I had entirely forgotten about that piece until I until this talk recently. This was another one of those blending of female figure or figuration and landscape and possibly architecture. This is a outline of my home state of Ohio, where I grew up, and some little feet at North Canton, where my mother still lives. So that's just to kind of show a little bit about my obsession, I think, from a long time ago with extremes in scale. I've always kind of had a hard time with the middle range, and I think it's because this is my ongoing theory that my body took that space, or my body was used to make the works. For example, this piece. I'm skipping past undergrad, grad school, and like a year or so, maybe, or I don't know, soon after I graduated, maybe a year. But this piece was made basically by dancing the waltz. I put paint on my feet, and that helped me arrive at the what do you call them? They were kind of the stakes where the spires would land. So it was almost as if the footprints were the blueprints for the cathedral. And I really spent some time looking at cathedrals and how they're constructed, and how to extrude sculptures from a flat plane. And I was looking a lot at, there was like a year of kind of looking at pipe organs, and because of course they're on the interiors of these cathedrals. Sometimes I would get a little kernel of an idea on a project. I'll just point out, for example, this little string experiment became really important later. This is called All the Stops, and I made this without knowing at the time, but Peter Bruegel, his Tower of Babel painting was based on the Roman Colosseum, and this was me imagining that a pipe organ was built out of a slice of the Roman Colosseum. So again, even though there isn't a body, there's a sense that a body could sit in the middle somewhere, or sit at the seat or the arena. And here you might imagine walking the path of this labyrinth that was also extruded from the ground. So this is the labyrinth I drew on the ground. So not footprints, but some kind of flat plane, again, that's pulled up into 3 dimensions. This is loosely inspired by the painting at the top, but I kind of freestyle sculpted the top element of the sculpture and cast that in wax, melted the wax, and recast that melted wax form into a solid form, and that's what the bottom is. This piece is called Self-Melt, and again I noticed this connection later. It all I'm ending with work from the Park Show, so I'm noticing how much everything has led to that work. So this is kind of in a year of working with the Tower of Babel and imagining different scenarios of how it could have been built with the assistance of imagined bees. And I was invited here to make a work for the Sharjah Biennial. This was in 2009. And this was my first public, so I guess I'm going to probably talk about my work in terms of how it relates to this last project, because I'm still sorting through that. So I don't always show this work, but I realized that it was one of those really difficult projects that I guess happens at biennials because they're so complex and disorganized, where I didn't get my materials until I don't know how late in the game. This was like plan D of my kind of conceptualizing what I would do. But I was left with a lot of this steel rod. And so I started just welding it into this spiral. So it's almost like this erupting, half-built tower popping out of a volcano. So again, like a landscape kind of converging with the built structure. And this is a pretty tall piece. That was all I could kind of do. But I was really fascinated then, like drawing, making a sculpture, almost like you would make a drawing. But it was an interesting lesson. So up till this point, I had kind of implied the figure in my work, but I hadn't really zeroed in on it. So I gave myself this task to do figural work, and the only way that I could get my head around that was to think of it in terms of, again, lines and planes, and to think about the body as in an art historical sense, I guess, as like a built construction. So this is I took an image of a carved marble sculpture of a kind of a Madonna form, and it tried to extrude it by literally holding a printout of this thing and welding it forward. So you can kind of see a woman in repose. This is her head with a column coming out of it. Can you kind of see that a little bit? Okay, so I can't tell what people can see. So this is the back of it. So what's interesting is I was working so much from the front and trying to extrude the form up, and walking around it all the time, as I do, obviously, but having no information about the back of the figure, the piece kind of had this really like linear quality from the side, where it kind of the figure looked round from the front and flat from the back, and I found that experience really interesting. And I was also kind of friends or becoming reacquainted with someone that I went to high school with, who had become a famous magician, and we were talking about the nature of like illusion and attention and distraction in his craft, and then in art and the experience of art, and so I started thinking. I mean, it kind of put certain things into focus. So that's why the house of cards with the playing cards, I think, popped into mind. A more playful, constructive way of building a tower. And at the same time I was building that, I made this piece called Edge of Critical Density, which again uses lines and planes, but here they're much softer. The planes are just these swirls of fabric, and the lines are these, you can obviously see. This is what I consider the pedestal, which is this horizontal line here, is an outline of a spiral galaxy, and the top, the strings are all kind of coming from where stars were located. And I never actually told anyone that, but the top of the see when you go off script, the top you can see is a woman, a little bit. So she kind of connects. Anyway, yeah. So, how did we get here? This is the next year, I think, 2010. In any case, it's my first. Well, this is it re-exhibited somewhere else, but in its first iteration in this space, it was the Hammer Museum, and it was my first solo museum exhibition in LA, and it was. It was a small room, and I had been making such large-scale works that you couldn't really enter, and I was given this room, and I thought, I haven't made like an installation in a while, and I guess I'm defining that as just something touching a wall, like a sculpture touching a wall. Otherwise, I hadn't made something like that since maybe grad school, and I noticed a strange condition about the space where I guess it wasn't so strange, but there was this wall didn't reach the top of the ceiling, you can see, and then behind that wall is the street. So it would have been like a storefront facade, but the whole project sprung from more or less a couple things that happened at once. An observation of an ancient time-telling device that I saw in the Babylon show in the British Museum, I think, and noticing these strange mechanical devices that were used before time was standardized, and learning that there was an inventor by the name of Al-Jazari who was an Islamic kind of polymath and sculptor, essentially, and he made these giant clocks that were these big Rube Goldberg devices. And anyway, so that was some research I was doing, and then when I came to this space and I saw that there was this dropped wall, the narrative became what's coming out from behind that wall. So I had all this art sludge coming through my clock. This is a water clock. I called it Water Thief. So a water clock is like an ancient time-telling device where you can tell how much time has passed by observing the water that's dropped through a vessel. And this is one of his miniaturist drawings, this guy Al-Jazari. He wrote a book called The Book of Knowledge and Ingenious Mechanical Devices, which was an encyclopedic record of his inventions, like that 100-some inventions that ranged from time-telling devices to phlebotomy devices to there were all these robotic musicians that would come out. Anyway, that's what that piece was. This is another piece that kind of feels like it was random in the chronology, but not, because I planted the seeds for this work in that first figurative piece. It's called Actor, but I wasn't terribly satisfied with my. I felt like I cheated the system or something. I didn't really do figurative work properly, so I made this on the invitation of a small. Well, it's not so small, but it's like an editions print shop, kind of. They also do sculpture editions called Graphic Studio in Tampa, Florida. And they wanted me to see if I had an idea for a small bronze thing tabletop thing. So I didn't have an idea like that. But I had this idea, which was much bigger than they were hoping. But the bronze component isn't so big. It's really that the bronze doesn't quite fit the scale of the pedestal, the plinth. So this is called Immortal Repose.
How big is it?
It's about that big by 5.5 by 5 by 5. So it's a little above. The plinth is sort of, you experience it like you should be looking, high up on a standing figure. But in my reading, I got a degree in art history too. My reading of women in most paintings, let's say most Western paintings, they're always kind of landscape pose. They're not vertical, and so I wanted her to kind of have. And this also kind of came from the material lesson that I learned from that work, Self Melt, the upside down building. With the melted version of itself. So obviously I didn't melt the bronze, I melted the wax. And so anyway, so she's aware of herself melting, so she's kind of playing with. And those are her feet. I have this kind of running thing with feet in sculpture from that little one that was in North Canton, Ohio. And then I started making these studies, which I thought of as sort of like a sketchbook, a sculptural sketchbook to the larger work. So I could kind of get a handle on the patinas and whatnot. So maybe you caught my pun. So I made a work with one figure now. And it unlocked this thing for me that I didn't know, or that I think I'd been resisting. Well, two things. I'd been resisting figuration, and I'd been resisting pedestals. Or in my mind, maybe my reactive young mind, I don't know, like pedestals were like a place for well-behaved sculptures. And I didn't want to ever have a pedestal. I never thought of my work as having a pedestal. It was always about, building a space or an environment or something. But now I thought, well, this is interesting territory. And because the previous piece only worked, with a pedestal, I think, at the time. It made sense. Because the medium changed the course of what I felt I could do. So two things came in now this is a unique work. The bronze obviously is editioned, but this is not editioned. So I started thinking about the pedestal as a sketchbook, or like the first mark that you would make on a sculpture, sort of, but in reverse. So I found a bunch of pedestals that were left over from a gallery show that my friend was working at, brought to my studio, like 7 big pedestals. And so I started making work with those for the next few years. This is the first one, and I used 2 figures here. It's called Cenotaph for 2. Actually, the symposium from a few weeks ago, which, like, the 7th time I've referenced it, sorry, but it was about monumentality, or monuments. I think it was about it was about monuments, or removing public monuments. And I was thinking about, I was like, why? I mean, obviously I have the show at the park now, but I was like, why am I being asked to talk about this? And then I thought, actually, this idea of monuments been pretty central to my work for a while, in an oblique sense, at the least, but in a direct sense, in this case, this is called Cenotaph for 2, and I learned that a cenotaph is kind of like a burial site for something that where the remains are not present. So it's either, it's a memorial or like a monument, but there's no actual body there. There's no bones. There's no, it might be for like an army or like a single person whose remains are elsewhere. And they're always for one or many, but never 2. So this is Cenotaph for 2. And you come around the piece and notice that some of it's kind of bitten away. And then I realized that I could get lots of different narratives and lots of different, let's say, direct, like, I don't know, problems from rearranging the composition or the geometries of a set of pedestals. And that's how I started this piece. So I set up this condition of these pedestals here, and then started slowly removing matter from it. I noticed that I have an instinct to have the work be always transparent on some level, although I don't use reflective materials unless it's gold leaf. But I don't use mirror or glass. Maybe I will, but I hadn't to this point. But the work was still always built from so many small parts that you could see through. It wasn't ever like a big sculpture that was kind of containing space. The space was always made available. So here again, there's 2 sculptures, one there, or 2 figures, and these came out of this whole thing came as a result of small decisions, small marks, let's say, until I'm making it sound very mysterious, but it was very simple. I wanted to remove the matter from this pedestal, so I cut a chunk of it out and made it more open. And that directed me to make a diagonal line. And that's what happened. And then that diagonal line kind of caused all these other landscapes to follow the mountainscape. So this was a puddle, and the mountain grew, and And so I noticed this fairly hard pyramid form, like a triangular. I'm really like looking at these as geometries in a way, or like being directed by the geometries or the form, at least in this one. Even though everything's very soft, I call this piece Trace of a Fictional Third. So there's one figure here and one figure here, and if you would stand here, you would be the third figure in the pyramid. So there's still an implied space for another body or my body or somebody to stand. This is at the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas, and this time I did have this storefront experience. It's a beautiful Renzo piano design museum, and anyone can see the exhibitions walking by on the street, which I felt was very powerful. And I think that was the first. Well, I don't know. I think this towing the line between the public and the private became really important for me here. And I think probably I was hoping to just be fully in the public at some point. But this was an interesting experiment, I guess, because I thought of that glass facade as kind of a theatrical fourth wall. You know, the separation of the real and the fictional, the thing, on stage and the audience. And so I thought of this as a sort of theater space. And when you enter the gallery, you come in backstage, what I thought of as backstage. And you see everything is liquid and horizontal. And then in the front, you see the vertical and the horizontals converge. And then you also see a figure converge here. This is, the title of this piece is Godiva's Fourth Wall. And this is the first time I worked with this fictional character, Godiva. She comes from a 20th century novella. It's about an archaeologist who has a bas-relief sculpture of a woman passing through a wall, a robed woman walking mid-stride, and he becomes fixated on this woman. He starts to hallucinate her. He's German. Did I mention he's an archaeologist? He's like this, academic. And so he's sort of out of touch with his desires, and he starts to hallucinate this woman who leads him all the way to Pompeii. He studies her feet in this really weird fetishistic way, and navigates through crowds and thinks he sees her, and then sometimes she becomes part of the building. It's a very atmospheric, strange, surrealist kind of novel. In fact, the surrealists picked up on it, but it was Freud that made the whole thing very famous. He analyzed the story as sort of this excavation process that's similar to psychoanalysis, because at the end of the story, the protagonist discovers that the woman he's been chasing, who was sort of an apparition up till this point, was his childhood crush named Zoe, and she led him to kind of unpack or unearth his repressed desires. So this figure is the first, this sculpture is the first time I worked with her, but she's since made appearances in my work. This is called Noli's Orders, and I think it's the most besides the park show for indoor work, I guess it's maybe the most monumental work. I, again, set up this condition of pedestals, but this time they were laid on a simple grid. And I started to think about what number it would take to feel sort of like a civilization or like a small population. I started bringing my friends in to lay around on my couch in the studio, and I would cast them in different positions. and have them kind of hold a certain pose from a particular mannerist painting or something I was looking at. Like this is from a Pontormo. This one is from a Pontormo painting, and actually these both are, but from two different paintings. Whatever. Anyway, and it's called Noli's Orders, after Noli, the Noli map, which was the first time, it was in the mid-1700s, that Rome, the Pope commissioned this, that there was a map made of Rome that showed the public and private spaces efficiently, and it wasn't a pictorial map, so it was, positive and negative spaces, mass and void. The public spaces were etched out. So this was like a revolutionary way of thinking about the city and about space, and it had a very sculptural implication, of course, and so that's why I titled it that. So you might have noticed that sometimes I take these small notations from art historical places. In the case of this work, I took a snapshot of this garment here. This is just like a Gothic painting that was at the Prado, and I became really fixated with this cloak. So this is the first time I used a computer. I do sometimes, but this was tough. But I'm pretty okay with Photoshop. So I took that image and I used the magic wand tool to delete all of the parts of the cloak that weren't the ornament. And then I worked with that file and sent it to, this was a residency in Austin, and you could work with any number of departments in the school. So I had this access to the CNC router, and I sent them the file so they could cut me from hard material all the ornament that was left from the cloak. So in effect, I am making this fabric a structural element. I used it as a column to hold the rest of the painting in place. I guess it's a sculpture, but I was thinking of sort of delaminating the material of the painting, the paint from the pictorial element of the painting. It's, I don't know, a weird idea, but most of the time these are just ways to get started. I was trying to, I don't know what I was trying to do. I was working on this for a long time. This was another moment that I had where it was, I felt like I really learned from the material how much I could gain by listening to its potential, I guess. It's that inner modernist in me that's like truth to materials, but to this crazy, and that is maybe hard, where the material is almost hard to recognize. This is a process that I first figured out in this work, where I mix a pigment into essentially a gypsum, and so they're basically common materials. In principle, it's like fresco, but the material is heavy, and as I paint it against my wall, I control the drip, the gravity, not gravity itself, but obviously like how far the drip might go and the colors and whatnot. And I started to try to isolate that drip, that one color that populates a painting. Anyway, that's to explain how I got to this work. Because when I learned that I could make this, when I learned this process, when I figured it out, I realized that I could really now work with the walls of the gallery and start thinking about, that issue, the eternal problem of the picture plane. So this is sort of an architectural intervention, let's say. I'm working on these from the back and reverse. I don't really see the image until it comes off the wall. And this was another iteration, I guess, of the same process, but without color. Now it has this ability to describe space and mass, and not a pictorial space. But I wanted to learn how to make this happen over a contoured surface, and so I made it happen over this female form that's sort of sinking into. This piece is called Antonym, sinking into the plinth, and inside the colors are dripping out of her foot. I make drawings. Sometimes I take the figures out of existing paintings. This is a Pontormo painting too, or based on the geometry of a Pontormo painting, but with the figures removed. But I don't have the reference in for you. All my drawings are on Mylar. And so when I didn't have a wall to cut out in a gallery space, I wanted to keep working with this process, so I started to just make them to hang as if they were paintings. I mean, obviously they're not really they're paintings. I call them panels. There's like a lot of debate about what to call them in my head. This is the only sculpture that, all my drawings are untitled. This is the only sculpture that I left untitled. It's a weird piece, but I don't actually show it in my talks much, but I think it taught me, I don't know what it taught, I'm just gonna, someone wrote a long time ago that soon after I made that piece, that was like very important to my work. Or I don't know, I'm paraphrasing badly, but it's like one of those pieces that I know has the answer to some other question I haven't remembered or something. They're mirrors, essentially. This is a bronze mirror with the liquid reflectivity pouring out of it. This is a concrete mirror. It's called Fool's Gold. And the gold here, the gold leafing kind of spills out, and it hovers, you don't have a detail of it, but it hovers ever so slightly over the pedestal. And then on the sides it becomes a drawing, much flatter. So I think, again, it's going from like dimension to plane, or plane to dimension. And then there's another bronze that I did, I guess, on the topic of vision and seeing. So last works were actually inspired by this specific sculpture I saw outside the Paris Opera House of it was like a mirror. This one of the female figures was holding a mirror, and you could see the reflection of one of the other figures carved into the stone mirror that you wouldn't normally see. And this weird trickery of the material was like, just stopped me in my tracks. So I made these without looking. I call them my blind busts. I had 3 of them, but the top part I made just kind of imagining my own or some features. And there are more of those panels. So the original clay works that I made molds from for the bronze were sitting around my studio, and I started to have this kind of attachment to them, and I started to think that they deserve their own unique sculpture. So I started with the clay heads that were the origins of the bronze blind busts, and described a narrative around those. So here, this work called Head in the Clouds, holding my house in North Canton. So I started to gather these collections of people holding out-of-scale homes. I have like 100 more of these. But they're like donors or patrons of a building. I just love that. So speaking of the remainders of projects that I can't get rid of, this was the figure that I used to build that work Antonym. And it was also in my studio for a long time. And so was its leg. And I wanted to make, I don't know how to explain this piece except for to say that this was the start of this sculpture. It drifted off of the pedestal and took some of the land mass with it, and as I was making this, the leg was sitting in my studio exactly in this location relative to the body. And I started to get really attached to it, laying there. It had this like real weight, like super, super sad. And I didn't want anyone to touch it. So, so I put it on a pedestal like a raft. And that's the story of that piece. I called it Phantom Limb. And it was bracketed by two works. This was at the Vienna Secession, and these walls don't normally exist, but I made them to kind of bring the space in a little bit, I guess. I don't know. But these two walls opposite each other come from female characters. In this case, this is comes from this painting by Hans Memling. It's very hard to tell, I understand, but I'm telling you anyway. That's where it came from. It's called Allegory of Chastity, which is hilarious. Obviously, from modern eyes, like this entire mountain skirt that comes out of her waist is essentially her chastity belt. But she looks like, to me, I felt like she had this very composed and polite way of plugging a volcanic eruption. That's what I saw. So I put her on one side of the gallery, and on the other side of the gallery, I put the woman who was walking through Pompeii, Gradiva. And these two fictional characters, one from a painting, one from a story, I didn't really know at the time, or maybe I didn't realize I don't know. They were. I kept returning to these figures. I use a lot of art historical references, mostly Northern European, early Renaissance stuff. But these two characters kind of were hovering around, and they made an appearance together for the first time at the Vienna Secession. This was a work called Smokescreen, and the sculpture behind it is called Smoke and Mirrors. This is one of the original blind bust clay heads that I used. And again, not realizing the connection until I mixed up my slides. This is another volcanic eruption of sorts. So I had this head coming out of this kind of very ornate plume of smoke that I carved. This is the first time I got to try, well, kind of, yeah, maybe, definitely a panel outside. This was at a UNESCO preserved Buddhist temple in Nara, Japan, and it was a very holy site, and the city invited artists along the Silk Road to propose a work for various sites around the city. It's like a city loaded with temples, Buddhist temples. And I was to represent the very end of the Silk Road, which, as you know, was the kind of main highway across Asia that, allowed for the exchange of goods and culture and da-da-da. So Syria was on the one end. And so I was asked as kind of the Syrian representative. But of course I live in New York, and so it felt a little like I should extend the road to New York, because I don't know, that's the kind of cultural trade I could offer. I wasn't living in Syria anymore. So I took a piece from the Met Cloisters, which is the unicorn of the unicorn tapestry. I forget what it's called. It's a series of tapestries, but I'm forgetting what the one is called. Unicorn in Captivity, I think. So I called mine The Unicorn Escapes, because the site that I had to work with, there it is, the site that I had to work with was supposedly the site where they believed a dragon lived, and so it's very, very, they're very precious about anything changing in the environment. This was like a big deal to let art was like the first time ever they've let a contemporary artist do anything. Like you couldn't even kill a mosquito, you had to like brush it off your hand, and I'm working in this swamp condition. I did not kill any mosquitoes on that entire trip intentionally, so I felt very proud. This is my more recent show, and in September at the gallery. And I'm returning here to, well, I'll tell you kind of why I was redirected here, or towards Al-Jazari again. I was a finalist for a big sculpture prize that I didn't win in London, but I had done all this research and work. It was for the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they wanted a work that had to do with Islamic technology in the golden age of Islam. And as Ben mentioned, I grew up in an Islamic household, but my learning of my heritage is also from a distance, right? Because I wasn't taught these things, but on the heels of that lost commission, I had done so much research about Al-Jazari, and I was looking at his candle clocks this time, which is devices he had made that told time by lighting candles, essentially, and having an entire mechanical system function based on the lighting of a candle. So I really interpreted some of his designs, but I started. This is based on this design, sort of. It's called The Candle Clock and the Swordsman. So there's a candle. You know what? I don't know if I have time to describe the mechanics. Okay, I'll tell you. It probably won't take that long. This probably took as long as describing the mechanics. Okay, so so there's a sheath, a brass sheath, surrounded by another sheath that kind of closes off the entire candle clock. So it basically just looks like this long tube in his rendering. I took the external tube out so you could see it, and I changed it. It was circular, but I made it hexagon. And anyway, there was a candle that was attached, that had a weight attached to it, and it was the weight was attached to some gears and pulleys, such that when you lit the candle, it would push up against a cap that was locked in place, and the weight would drop, and a ball would come out of a ball channel. And this little ball, once a certain unit of time had passed, like an hour or so, mine was at the 2 hour and some mark, but a ball would drop out, and then you light the candle, and then you wake up and you see how many hours have passed. So it's super crude, but I wanted to make mine work, because the last one didn't work, obviously. So that's what this is. I lit my candle on the summer, the solstice. Not the solstice. No, I'm sorry. I'm so fried, you guys. I'm really tired. It was when the eclipse. Thank you. It was the eclipse. So I lit. It was on August 26th or something.
21st.
Thank you. And I was close. And I lit it, and within 2 minutes of the eclipse happening on the West Coast, the ball dropped out of my device. So I was very proud that it worked, and then I let it go. It didn't work after that. I moved on, and I kind of finished the sculpture. That was one of the pieces in the show. This was the other. Now this is another huge candle clock. But this time I oversized the candle, and I made one of the sheath that surrounds it. And again, this is my very broad interpretation. The mechanics are represented, but the rest of the clock would look nothing like this. But the external sheath here was made by basically casting, in the same way that I make the panels, casting the citadel from this painting of another Islamic, let's say, genius who named Nasuh, who cataloged the military campaign of the Ottoman Empire in maps. So I recognize this image because this is the Citadel of Aleppo, and I, was born in Aleppo, and the Citadel is the prominent site in the city. It's a medieval fortress that hovers over the entire city. And so he always had falcons, and the balls would come out of the mouths of the falcons. This is another one. I had small, medium, and large. This is called the Falcons Fortress. And now this is what's in the park, at Madison Square Park. So this piece is called, I should have put the other work in first. So I'm just figuring out how to talk about this. I'm going to start with this one first. have the order wrong. Well, anyway, this is, so there are 6 sculptures in the park. This one is the one that is the largest in the round sculpture. It's in the reflecting pool, and it took at it as its starting place that image, the Hans Memling figure. And what I did was I tried to again extrude this painting, this flat surface, into a sculpture. So I started by, it's about 14, well, it's like almost 14 feet high, but my studio wasn't quite that high, but I basically very quickly painted that mountain almost to scale on my wall. And then my assistant, so it was this really messy, drippy painting. And then my assistants traced that drawing with steel rods, and then I took that, basically a print of the steel rods, and welded the forms and extruded them forward so that the mountain became dimensional, but it wasn't really the mountain, it was the interpretation of the mountain through my sketch. But again, like, this whole thing is made, the origins of this huge sculpture is in this very liquid and improvisational, like almost nothing of a sketch, and the top I made also. This part is in bronze, but it's just a quick kind of axial drawing of a head. You know, when you learn drawing one, you do the vertical X and Y axis lines to establish the direction of the face. I know I have more to say about that piece, but it's called Citadel, and it's sort of like self-melt. You know what I did too recently? This I haven't really talked about much, but this relationship between these two characters that started at the Vienna show, they meet again here. So that sculpture in the fountain, in the reflecting pool, came from that image, and this Gradiva figure shows up here in this panel. So one sculpture in the reflecting pool, 2 in the oval lawn, and they're 2 panels. This is one panel. Oops. And that's the back of the other. This is the other. So they're bracketed by a hedge, and that creates this room, this interior, kind of more private space in the city. And on this wall is Hans Memling, and I got to get the photographer back out there because I don't have a really good image, but the top of this open space that you can walk into, through, is the Memling form. And so her mountain kind of evaporates, I guess, and you can walk through. And that's the back. So this is the first time I've allowed the structures to be visible. And that was interesting for me. It never felt appropriate until now because I think in some ways showing the back, especially at the scale of a New York City public park, really lets me articulate that extreme in scale, where from the front, the work you see up close, the line work, the paint dripping colors. And then you learn as you move around the work that the structure proceeds from that image. So it's like the picture part of the painting came before the structure, the canvas. It's like the image came before the canvas. The connective tissue happens just after I make the image. So that structure, that membrane, that just basically continues to grow to the point that it's, these big steel members. And I think that has a conversation with the skyscrapers around the city. And when you come in, I think it feels, more diaphanous or more transparent, even though, I don't know. I'm still working it out. You guys can tell me what. And so that's 3 sculptures, and the 3 other sculptures are called synonym, and they are sort of they're actually they're made from the work antonym that I had. That was the female on the soft pedestal with the color dripping out of her feet. This was made from that work, but this is an addition that I made not by pouring the cast, but by hand. They're each slightly unique. But they're parked throughout the lawns, like the peripheral lawns, so you can enter the park and maybe have a little sense of deja vu, and you're kind of introduced to the material from another scale or another perspective. I have 30 seconds left. That was an hour. That's all I have. I can answer questions.
The piece, I didn't catch the title, I don't know, with the white steel and the, what was that called? The white, with the all white, with the archways, and then we had the... In the park. In the park.
Oh, the one in the park. Sorry. This one of the panels. This one?
Yes.
This one.
Yes.
This one. This is called the Grotto.
So in your conception, were both pieces, elements of that?
Yes. Well, they're imperfect shadows of the inverse. Yes.
And did you also conceive of
the hedge? Yes.
The archetypes, the greenery? Yeah.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Actually, all of the plantings. I apparently was the first one to use plant material in the park, in the history of the park, or water, which is funny. Like I was like, oh, I used water and plant material. Like I hadn't really thought about that until I installed the show, and I was like, I don't know, natural.
Thanks so much. Such great work, really.
Thank you.
You talk about a lot of art historical references, and I'm wondering, so much of the work is really theatrical, and I'm wondering if you have any sort of theatrical references as well. I mean, anything from sort of, I don't know, science fiction, special effects to stage set design.
I mean, my earlier work was really sci-fi inspired, I think. I made a piece called Attack of the Actual Factual and the Golden Galaxy when I was I was really into complex titles. And actually the early work, the beehive, the honeycomb piece. That was also, and I just was needing to remove material, but that was also happening when the Large Hadron Collider was first detonated, and I called the show Reverse Collider because I was making a sort of connection between the enterprise enterprising minds that built the Tower of Babel and what was happening with the Large Hadron Collider. Like, it was kind of a modern day Babel with this singular language of math and science, kind of bringing everyone together on this like impossible mission that was meant to find the God particle. You know, it was like very, it had a sci-fi element for sure. And the work with the strings, that wasn't quite sci-fi, but cosmologically, the title of that was Edge of Critical Density. Critical density is like a cosmological term. So yeah, you're right in your intuition. I just left a lot of that material out. I mean, that one piece with the one of the organ pieces, it's a pipe organ spaceship.
Yeah, and it may well not be at all in your realm of what you were thinking about, but I kept thinking about Geiger also. You know, aliens, the sort of those labyrinths of
Sure.
strings and saliva. Stuff.
Yeah, I think mine's like less like gross.
You're obviously a very prolific artist, and you make big pieces. How do you manage to produce so much in the time you have?
I don't sleep a lot.
Okay, I can see that.
I look tired. I'm tired. It's true. I don't know. I don't know. I worked a lot in my 20s, and now I have a kid, and I kind of thought that I was like, what's the term? Like, loading one side, because I was like, I'm not going to be able to do all this when I'm like 80, like at this, you know. So I was like, I'm going to do all this stuff now, and then I'll learn how to make small work later. I think like I just had this like, I think that I wasn't really interested in making sculptures that I could walk around. I wanted to make things that I could be in. So I just, that was the work that I wanted to make, and that's what I had the appetite for. And I don't know. I mean, I'm also very efficient. Like it was awful. Like you know, it was like my knees are giving out already. So.
And you have assistants.
I have assistants. Yeah. I've been lucky to have a lot of people help, because they can learn a lot of, you know, I'm not just having them stretch canvases. So when I was first starting, a lot of like students wanted to help, but now I have paid assistants, and but they just, you know, they do, and this is what I mean by I'm efficient. I have like streamlined my work such that literally everything that's not a creative decision is done by someone else. I mean, it's for the most part, you know, like I don't need to sit and reinforce all these. Like I figured out how to do it, you know, over the course of 10, 12 years, and I teach them exactly how I do it, and that's it. But they have to sometimes wait on my cue. I don't know. That's like another conversation about assistants. But I work all the time.
Some of them are foundry workers.
No, the foundry stuff is the only thing that I don't do. I don't have a foundry, so I haven't made a lot of bronzes. But when I have, I've been kind of resident. Like I've been there to do a lot of the.
I really love how it's almost like you're doing 3D mark making that builds up in a swarm into this like mass, right? And I'm wondering if you're inspired at all by Julie narrative.
Yeah, I love her work, sure. Yeah, I think she's brilliant. I love her work. Yeah.
You said how you're talking about the installation as something, a sculpture that touches the wall, and then going over the wall. You mentioned that, and then some of the pieces like in Vienna were in the wall.
Yeah.
And I wondered, you mentioned you wanted to feel surrounded by it, but yet there were pieces that are like embedded as architecture. I'm curious about that strategy or what that did for the larger project.
Like I could probably do a whole one day just like presentation on my work through the lens of examining boundaries and parameters, because that's what a wall is essentially, and I think that at my core, I'm always fixated on that. I mean, like I made a little private room in a public park. You know what I mean? Like I'm making. I don't know, but they're big. But there is an intimate. You can have. I hope you can have intimate moments. I do with the work as I'm making it. The strokes aren't always that big, but I'm always limited by a wall, whether it's a gallery or in my studio, and so there's a natural conflict there, and in the same way that you're always limited by gravity as you're building a sculpture, like that's one of the core problems that sculpture has, is how it meets the floor and how you get it off the floor, and that's why I didn't like pedestals for a long time, but I think it was because I was using the wall, so there's always some blank. I also think that drawing, even though I don't have time to talk about my drawings so often, but I was first a drawing major in school, and I feel like sculpture and drawing have a very deep relationship and weird relationship, and more than painting. So the painting is like the middle zone that I'm still like perplexed by. I don't know how to like make images, but I like love images. But you know, it's like sculpture and drawing here meet in the middle in the panels and the wall. I think that's what's happening.
I'm so compelled by these embedded images, these sort of embedded drawings in your work, and how they kind of disappear in this sort of cascade of materials. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your focus on the sort of northern early Renaissance compositions in particular that seem to. You were talking about that.
Yeah. Well, it comes from that area of like that thing I don't really understand, which is like image making. Like I'm not a painter, and when I say that, the best way I can try to describe that is like I think my strength is in structures and in spatial thinking. I don't have like images in my head of pictures that I want to paint or represent. I don't have them. I don't know how people have them. I need something to respond to. So in part, I use those images because they're open source, and I'm an art history. You know, I love that was my double major. More to fill the time, but because I realized making sculpture takes time, so I had to take some extra classes. But I thought I liked writing about. I mean, I wrote my honors thesis on Dada and digital art, which have nothing to do apparently with my work, but I think have everything to do with my work still. But yeah, I'm not. I mean, and it's weird because that's the least tactile. It's possibly like the least least tactile of all of the movements in contemporary art is Dada. It's like maybe even less tactile than concept. Like I don't know. I mean, it just burst open everything, and digital art also is not very tactile, and yet my work is entirely made by hand, like every inch of it. There's very little that's machine, So it's just like a weird. I don't know. Like I don't know. What was your question? I don't remember. What are these paintings? So I like them because they're weird and funny. Like I think that's just like a gut reaction. I mean, the Renaissance, the High Renaissance is beautiful. Everyone agrees, and it's kind of also predictable. And I'm more interested in how artists can kind of work on the fringe of a certain category. You're given like, make me a deposition, make me an ascension, an enunciation, and these are artists. Like They might not believe in that stuff, but they're painting it. It's a commission. And it's interesting to find those individual expressions hidden in these categories. And it's interesting for me to try to decode what they were privately thinking from an artist's point of view. So I think that's why I like them. And also they're just weird. Like they play with scale in a weird way. Like I was just in Venice and that's why I'm tired. I'm still like, it was just a couple of days ago. And this museum, I forget what it was, but it was like, I didn't know what was going on in that place. There were like people being skinned and a burning bush that looked just like a total abstract painting, but it was like from like the 1700s. It's just like there's so much weird stuff in these things, and it's like how is this? I don't know. It's just it's so rich with material for me, and it's also like a way for me to probably work on things that I. Can kind of analyze, like I didn't grow up in a Christian household, so I don't really like know what all of these biblical scenes really mean. I don't really know the narrative, so I can come to it as an artist and an art historian, and also as someone who has, who also feels deeply connected to the history of Western art because I grew up in America, so it's feels like I can use it how I want. I'm sorry. I didn't see you because of the post, but so. Go ahead.
I know you're tired.
No, I'm here. I'm having a great time.
Okay. I don't want to start a fight or anything, but isn't that a tactile? Like, isn't like wasn't who am I thinking of? I'm thinking of Kurt Schwitter's. I'm thinking of all of the collage.
Yes.
Piling on top of.
Yes.
And also like how all of this kind of like the way you're placing these cultural movements and these artistic responses into like automatically chronologize periods of time that are almost never without warring. And so I'm thinking about like so
never without warring.
Warring happening. Like
okay. War.
And I'm thinking about like I'm this makes me even more fascinated that like you had this interest in Dada that seems so disparate from your interest in the Renaissance, but I always recognize Dada as like this like desperate this like collective communal and rather desperate artistic response to the disempowerment of war and like this like this gross societal dehumanization. And like how these artists like got together and responded by piling absurdity on top of absurdity.
Yes.
And so I see you inside of that too.
Yeah, I mean that's great. I mean I responded to their absurdity first, but I don't think people look at my work unless I started to put in my older work, and because I think I used to have a sense of humor.
It is pretty absurd. I mean, you talked about magic and wonder at one point, and like just I'm completely like dumbfounded by what I'm seeing tonight. You are prolific and it's amazing. Your delivery is so mild. I don't know if that's the jet lag, but
I'm tired.
It is mind blowing.
Well, thank you.
The way it's made, the way that it like talks about painting and drawing and sculpture and space, inside of spaces and outside of spaces, like it's pretty like it's so great that it is pretty absurd.
And I'm done. I'm out. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that. I don't
Thank
know
you.
Question the work is just
Well, let me. Thanks. Yeah, spread the word. Yeah, follow me on Instagram. I'm like the least active Instagrammer, but I actually want to like pick up on your point about like Dada not being or being tactile or not being tactile. I find that like incredibly interesting because I agree that it was so tactile in terms of like collage and like even their poetry was concrete poetry, so it had a tactility. But I guess in its totality, they weren't totally focused on optics and like it was so much more like stream of consciousness and so much more ephemeral. I mean, there's not that much that remains from Dada, and it happened in a blip. It was like 5 years or something, and it I think that's kind of maybe what I think is surprising. I was just projecting, like, why is it surprising that I was so obsessed with Dada for a while, and I've never really, like, again, told anyone. I've, like, told 2 people, but we're all friends now.
Well, no, I have to give you my experience of this work, and I went to Madison Square Park like a week and a half ago, and they were having a huge barbecue in it.
In the space?
In the
Stop.
whole thing. A fundraiser for the park, and they drained the fountain. And
I saw pictures.
No,
of
because
that.
there were like all these drunk people, right? So they're like, "Oh, we're not going to do that." And then
Oh,
I'm
no
walking here,
way.
and
No one told me
people
that.
sunbathing underneath this piece, and I have to like, and then I have to like look only at parts of it because they think I'm looking at them, and there are always like absurdities out there. I have a photo of someone making the exact same pose as some of your sculptures, like.
Yeah, no, I knew that would happen. I actually made them a little taller so people couldn't go like peekaboo,
Yeah. And then these hedges, I had never seen them, and I was like, have I never noticed these hedges ever? It was just like an English garden, and so I think the kind of spontaneous encounters that like public art can make is like kind of amazing. And so now this is forever sort of twinned with that barbecue. It's like, you know what I mean?
No!
In the best possible way. No, it was.
No, I get what you're saying.
People like activating it.
Yeah.
Really
it's a trip. I mean, I totally get what you're saying. Like, there was, Memorial Day weekend came up, and there was like my works were surrounded by like little American flags, and it was weird, but like I don't know. I mean, also cool. Like, it was just cool because it was sort of like I have such a privilege to have my work in this park, and that's part of New York. Like, sometimes this is the context you're in. That's it. It's weird though. I mean, it's interesting because so much of my work has classical references or anti-classical or whatever. Art historical references. So in our little bubble, so this is the weird thing about having my work in a public space for the first time, is it made me realize that all of this work I've been doing has been only made available to like 0.001% of the population. And that's exhausting to think about. Like, wow, this 60,000 people walk through this park every day. And so there's going to be people that walk through that are just like, what is that? I could have done that, and I overheard people say that. Most people are like, cool, it's cool. What's that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
They couldn't say that. No, they couldn't do it. I know that. No, but like I heard. I mean, it was like, I was like back in high school. Like, wait, what'd you say? I worked really hard. But it was interesting because suddenly, in the context that I've gotten used to, my work, like I said, has this so much conversation about classicism and art history and all of this stuff. So to be put in a public space where suddenly I'm seen as like this contemporary artist, I'm like, wow, people can now understand. They maybe don't like it, but now they know that this is contemporary art. Like now they know this is an option for. But I don't know. Like, it was just like interesting to hear people. After I got over my hurt for like 30 seconds, but then I was like, shut up. The guy's an idiot.
Well, thank you so much.
Sorry.
I was just interested in knowing, like, so you mentioned the role of drawing, and I was just wondering, like, how much of your planning phase is sketching? Do you do maquettes, before you see the larger, sculptures, particularly the ones with the steel spires? Does they look really gestural, or is it a lot of it just you kind of diving in?
It's like 90% I'm just diving in. I very rarely, I like never make maquettes or models unless someone is twisting my arm. Almost all of it's improvised. I mean, not total. I mean, like, not totally, but a lot of it is. Like, I just start out with a very simple premise, and I've gotten better at tricking myself into like continuing when there's almost nothing to respond to. But yeah, I a lot of it's like trial and error and experience, like knowing structural things. But it's hard because, especially for this park, it took a lot of trust. Because this is the first time I had to work with engineers, and there was no way I was going to make a model of that thing in the fountain. I mean, there's no way. I couldn't. Like, I tried, and it wrecked everything. Like, it made things much more complicated for the engineer because it didn't, and everyone involved, because it didn't represent the work. There's no way. Every one of these lines was intuitive. It was started, like I said, from that drawing, and then I made that one half. I extruded the wall, so one half of the sculpture it was formed. Not in its entirety, not what you see here, but just the lines. It was really, really flimsy. And I pulled one half off the wall, and I did another kind of print, and that constituted the second half. I put the two halves together, and then for 6 months I stitched the whole thing together. And it was like maddening, and it was like a drawing, but I would be moving. It was sometimes, if I couldn't reach it, my assistant would be up there with the welder, and I would say 2 inches down, 2 inches towards the back corner, and then stop, weld, zoom. Like, it was, every one of those lines was intuitive. There's no way I can give that to an engineer. So he had to just trust me and then come in along the way. And that's, it was interesting. A lot of fights. But there's, that's how I know how to make my work. When I try to do something that's not natural to my process, it hurts everything. Like, it just doesn't, and like, I'm very flexible. Like, I try to, obviously I don't want things to fall and like hurt anyone, but, I'm so tired. I'll stick around if anyone has more questions, but thank you very much for your...